You probably never heard about mental spatial psychological diagnosis. And that's no miracle because it's the result of a new paradigm in psychology. That paradigm is not so new because when you really look in the books and in the journals, you find already a trace of 30 years of development in spatial cognition. And so there is research that points in the same direction for many years, and mental spatial diagnosis is a result of the conclusions from this. And the conclusion is that space is the primary organizing principle in the mind. So, or you could say, space is the medium of thought. Or everything that we think of happens somewhere. And that means that the space within my body and just around it is the place where I have my experience and where I create any type of cognition, visualizations, words that I say to myself, the feelings that I have. It all happens somewhere here. Now the thing is that this is an unconscious affair. It's happening on an unconscious level. Part of it, of course, is conscious because what we think sometimes, and quite often, of course, gets to our consciousness and we become aware of it. But most of the time we are not aware of how we think it and where we think it, but just what we think. And so when we respond to something, we respond on the base of our spatial thinking, but then we respond on the meaning that this spatial thinking has to us. And so we don't respond to the shape and the process, but to what it means to us and what type of emotions it raises in us. And that is immediately what makes our responses. Now, this research came also to the conclusion that orientation, you could say navigation, navigation in the real world, every organism that moves around needs to be able to navigate the real world to get to food, safety, partners. So it's a necessary capability to navigate among the things around us in our environment. That the same processes that we use to navigate the real world are used to navigate our world of imagination, of our concepts, of our abstractions. And so all thought, all mental activity is based on what's going on partly in the basis of the brain, in the hippocampus and the limbic system, where there are specialized cells and areas that take care of us knowing where to go and where we are. So these are the play cells and the grid cells and maybe other cells that help us to orient in space. And these knowledge comes from a lot of experiments with rats stemming from the 70s. And the people who came to this conclusion also received the Nobel Prize for this. The basic idea that everything is just supported by organization of the mind that's basically aimed at finding a way, that then on another level helps us to find our way in our concepts, in our memory. And when we create a model of our environment, when we create a map of the world, it's not much different from the maps that we create to find a way in the more abstract conceptual worlds that we spend a lot of our time in. Mental spatial diagnosis is the idea that when it's true, when it applies to everything in the mind, that space is the primary organizing principle, it also should apply to any type of mental issue. From a trauma to a personality disorder, everything must be also in this space. Now, and mental spatial diagnosis is the exploration of this mental space to see what are the patterns for certain mental issues. One of the main problems is with the DSM that first, that the symptoms on which a diagnosis are based are not so exclusive. For instance, when you have grief, a trauma or depression, it's not so easy to distinguish between these, and you really need to ask the client, do you know why you have these problems? And then when they don't know, you may come to the conclusion, oh, depression. Then when they say, yeah, I lost my partner, you will say, okay, it's depression, but then based on grief. Or they may say, yeah, something terrible happened to me. I was in an accident. And then you will say, okay, it's a traumatic experience. It's post-traumatic stress disorder. And part of it may show up as a depression. Now then the other thing, and I think this is the main point that Alan Francis made when he came out of retirement. He was one of the editors of the DSM-4, and then he saw when the DSM-5 was nearly ready that this would cause over-diagnosis. Because the work on the DSM-5 was so throughout, the people who were working on that had tried to really find a link between any difficulty in life, like when you were a victim of a terrorist attack or something, or when you were starving, or you had some medical examination that caused stress, anything, they try to link to psychological disorders. And they did a very good job, and I admire the work they did. But as Alan Francis noticed, yeah, this caused that there's a disease for everyone. In the DSM-5, there is no way when you get to the psychiatrist that you get out as a healthy person. Because one of the things is that there's no definition of health, because there's only diseases in the book. So this is a consequence of focusing so much on categorizing mental disorders. And then you have mental disorders and you have them categorized, but yeah, there's no way out of there. The only thing is that when you cannot diagnose a person for certain disorder symptoms, then you could say, okay, they are healthy now, so they have recovered. One of the problems that you have when you are diagnosed with a psychiatric disorder is that it doesn't work so well out in society. So the stigmatization is a problem. And on the other hand, it helps you to maybe get an allowance or be free from work or get other things, get help. Now from there on, but not as a criticism on the DSM type of diagnosis, but just by looking and by working with clients, by looking at clients with certain issues, and by working with these clients from the perspective of mental space psychology, so from the perspective that everything that goes on in the mind is going on in mental space, working on this base showed certain patterns, and then slowly evolved the idea that these patterns could also be a kind of psychiatric diagnosis. Is it possible, that was the question, is it possible to organize these patterns in such a way that when you are a psychiatrist or a clinical psychologist or somebody who works with people that have mental problems, to use that to orient yourself, what's wrong with this person, and then from there on give us any handholds to what to do. And this led to this little book, Mental Spatial Diagnosis. And this book is meant very serious, but it holds images. So it's a book full of pictures, and we will look at some pictures later in this talk. But these pictures are necessary because they illustrate spatial configurations. It's extremely hard to describe a spatial configuration in language. So this is something that already came up in the 80s when Some linguists found that experience is going on in 3 dimensions, but language is only 1 dimension. And so when you express your experience, you need to transcode 3 dimensions into 1 dimension. And when you do that, there's a lot of loss of certainty, of meaning. And that means that when you want to describe a spatial configuration in words, you get stuck. But when you use a 3-dimensional illustration, yeah. Now, when you do mental spatial diagnosis and you have a client that shows signs of depression, you go to look for their mental space. And one of the things that we discovered by exploring mental space is that there are things in mental space, intrusions, that block the experience of the client. And these intrusions are things that you can say that are in locations in mental space where they shouldn't be. Now, why is that? This starts with the idea that a normal, you could say healthy, undisturbed mental space tends to be organized in the following manner. It's that the present, the here and now, is sensed in where the person is located, so close to the body or into the body. And then from there on, there's projections into the future, where the client needs to use their imagination to think of what's going to happen in the future, holidays, their birthday next year, their future of going to their retirement and maybe to their death. And the further away in the future, the further away these projections, these imaginations are placed in this space. Now, and then there's also the past, and for the past holds the same rule, although the process of coming to creating the images of the past is different, because that's happening mainly from that you are within a situation in the present, and then you get to the next situation and you need, where you are, you need to let that go. And so that moves in many people out of their back. And so there's then a sort of conveyor belt type of experience where the past grows at your back, and the further away, yeah, that's further away in the past. This is what a general healthy mental space looks like. Another thing is that in most people's mental space, objects, so projections, you could say concepts, imaginations, representations that are in front, close and high and big, stand out, and they tend to be very influential. And so most emotions stem from seeing something straight in front, very close, maybe light and high up. Then when things get to the side, further away, and get lower, the influence is often less. This is sort of a general law, how people necessarily, generalizing on the base of their experience, create a mental space. Now, when we have to do with a client with depression or grief or trauma, these are the things that are the most common intrusions in mental space, the things that occupy locations that they shouldn't. Then we find that there may be something here or something here or something at the side, but very close. How people get depressed, that they often had some experience in their life that they couldn't cope with. There happened something, or they were not capable of dealing with something, or they had a dream of becoming something or being able to do something, and that didn't work out for them, so they had to give it up. And by giving it up, they decided, and this is not so much of a strong decision, but it may be a clear decision, but often it's just something that just slowly works its way into the person's life, to not think about it anymore, and then starts what in psychoanalysis was called, rightfully, repression. We have, of course, a history where all the concepts from psychoanalysis were discarded as fantasy concepts, and so we lost repression from the regular psychological discourse, because in the polarization between behavioral therapy and psychoanalysis, or humanistic therapy and psychoanalysis, people wanted to get away from a concept like repression. How hard they tried, they couldn't get away from this concrete phenomena. So it's proven many times, and since Jerome Singer in the 90s start to look at it again from a experimental psychological perspective, you could say it's fully proven that something like repression exists. And what you can find in people with depression, that they may have intrusions in their mental space like black clouds, and they don't know what causes that, but it's there, and it blocks their free view on what's behind there. So you could say it's a sort of filter over their perception. Now you perceive me on your screen. This is on the foreground of your awareness. But what you think to that, so maybe you have some conclusions or some values about what I do. These are decisive for your behavior. So for instance, when you continue to look and to listen to me, so that has to do with things that are going on in the background, and you could say that is decisive for what you do. And this is what we have in the wake state. So when you sleep, things change, so you perceive nothing out there, you're fully occupied with what's going on inside you, and that's your dreams. When you are awake and you have an intrusion in your mental space, so there's just a cloud, then what you're looking at is filtered through this cloud, but this cloud is unconscious, but this cloud is more decisive for your state than what you see. And it may cause that you are on a party and you don't like it and you don't know why, but when we would look at it, there is this black cloud in between you and the party. And so the black cloud is making your state, your mood. So when we have a strong desire for cars, we probably have these cars very close. And we're looking at them all the time. And on an unconscious level, they appear maybe every minute in our mind, and that can cause us some unrest. Then there are beliefs. And in the same sense as used in cognitive therapy, beliefs are also happening in mental space. And when you believe something very strongly, that means that there must be some idea that's represented very strongly. And when this is a limiting belief, when you cannot develop yourself further, when you maintain this belief, you need to look at where is this located, can we change it? Can we do something that opens the way to the future? Then social life. A lot of experience over the last 25 years is gathered with a model called the social panorama model. And this is in fact the landscape of people that we live in between our social reality. Now, not that many people have noticed that we live within a landscape of social representations, and that this landscape tells us who we are and who we need to be and who the others are. And when you look at how many people have difficulties with relationships, and that all these difficulties are programmed in a way in their social landscape, it's logical that when you explore the mental space of a person with a social issue, so with hatred or a lack of being part of something, yeah, then you can be helped by looking at construction of social life. And so there's the spiritual panorama, so that's how spiritual life is organized in mental space. Personality, and then it's about the self, and then of course you can also look how certain neurological issues appear in mental space. The mental spatial way of diagnosing was not a response, a critical response to the DSM-5. It developed from just working with clients and then discovering that some spatial patterns could be connected to certain disorders that were also described in the DSM, like for instance narcissism, and grandiosity, for instance. Now, these discoveries slowly led to a list, and the first list that was coming into being dealt with the self. It resulted from the discovery that the self was created, the experience of the self was made by the person by having feelings connected to images. Associated, you could say, that were conditioned to context, which means that the person enters a certain context that's familiar. In this context, they have already been somebody, someone. Automatically, the feeling and the images that belong to being that certain person are triggered, and the person just automatically becomes the person that fits into this context. When you work on the basis of the system of mental spatial diagnosis, this tells that, yeah, we have categories, like in the DSM. These are functional as a way of speaking about mental issues. So clinicians need to have words for things, and so we can say this is a language. And then beside this language, in this language you can describe what you think is wrong, but beside this language you can have representations of how the underlying mental spatial processes of this issue is functioning. Now, the relationship between the DSM and mental spatial diagnosis is not one-to-one, but there is a relationship that's strong enough to say that mental spatial diagnosis is an addition to the DSM diagnosis. For instance, when you have a typical antisocial personality disorder, we can look at how does the mental space of such a client appear. And for this we look then at how do they represent mankind? How are all the people they know represented? How far away? What's their size? Are they only at the front or only at the back, or are they all around? This spatial configuration tells a lot, because what you can find with some types of persons with grandiosity, so you could say some types of psychopaths, they may see all the other people as very unimportant, small, and have a great image of themselves. And sometimes they have also this idea that they are of a different species, so they're not connected, they're not having their feeling of self within mankind, but they're standing outside of that. When you work with a client like that, You know that the treatment needs to involve integrating their feeling of self in the representation of mankind. They need to become a member of mankind and not an outsider of mankind. And they need to see that the others are of a similar weight, similar value as themselves. I don't say that this is an easy thing to do, but probably you can find a history of development in which they created this constellation, this configuration, and then there were beliefs that developed during these stages, and so we can go for these beliefs, and these beliefs are probably the key to change the whole imagery. Takes the highest level of clinical skills. You need to be a very good cognitive therapist to work with these things, and you need to have very good rapport skills. You need to be able to stay in contact with a person like that and to motivate them to work along. And in a personality disorder like that, that's often difficult. So what can be the conclusion of this video? Now, it shows that we have a system of diagnosis that's operating for many years, the DSM, and that it has several problems. It has also some advantages. It offers a very detailed language to describe mental issues. But on the other hand, it doesn't tell much about what's healthy, and it doesn't tell much about how to treat a certain issue. So it's only a description of, on the basis of symptoms, what could the disease be that's causing this. Of course, this is based on medical thinking, that goes back to the Greeks, and that doesn't apply so well to psychological issues. It applies to it for a certain extent. Mental spatial diagnosis is a new development, and it will take a revolution to get it implemented because it's so different that I think it takes a lot of training. It takes people who are really interested and see the value of it. And the value would be that you have a system to monitor in a spatial manner how a certain type of problem is operating. So you have an idea of the psychological processes on a certain level of abstraction that cause the issue. And then by the same medium, in the same system, you can see what needs to happen, because mental spatial diagnosis has also includes reference configurations, a situation that we can know as when you have your mental space organized like this, you have no problem. So that you could say that's a reference for a healthy situation. So that means that with the help of mental spatial diagnosis, you can work towards psychological health. To me, the conclusion from this video could be that diagnosing mental issues with the DSM-5 is not the only way. I think the DSM-5 offers a language in which clinical psychologists and psychiatrists can communicate, a language that we can use in official documents, etc. But it's not helpful to understand the processes involved, only slightly. And mental spatial diagnosis will help us to have a clearer view on how people construct, how people have created their mental disorder, and also show logically how that should change in mental space. Now, this is only valuable when you can believe that space is the primary organizing principle in the mind. So only on the base of this paradigm it makes sense.